In the windswept Montana Highlands of 1877, where bitter cold cuts through even the strongest resolve, Willa Dean carved a future from nothing but scraps and stubborn hope. The pregnant woodworker lived alone on the edges of a boomtown that had forgotten kindness, spending her days shaping tools and toys, while townsfolk whispered behind closed doors about the unwed woman who dared to stand proud. Then came the knock that changed everything, a half-frozen cowboy with one leg, bleeding from a rifle wound, and eyes that held secrets deeper than mountain caves. Willa took him in, mended his wounds, and seeing his crude, splintered crutch, worked through the night by firelight to carve him something beautiful, a wooden leg strong enough to help him stand tall again. By dawn, he walked away without explanation. But what happened the very next morning when hooves thundered and gold wagons rattled up to her door? The morning light filtered through the frost-etched windows of Willa Dean's cabin, casting long shadows across the wooden floor her father had laid with his own hands 23 years ago. She sat at her workbench, her swollen belly pressed against the edge as she ran her fingers along the grain of a piece of pine, feeling for imperfections that would guide her blade. The wood spoke to her in ways that people rarely did any more honest, direct, without judgment or whispered condemnation. Her father's carving knife lay beside her, its handle worn smooth by decades of use. Thomas Dean had been the finest woodworker in 3 counties before consumption, took him 5 winters past, leaving behind a daughter who inherited not just his tools, but his stubborn pride and gentle touch with timber. The knife had carved toys for countless children, furniture for newlyweds, and hope into the hearts of those who understood that something made with care could last longer than the person who shaped it. The unfinished cradle in the corner seemed to watch her work, its half-carved rails a testament to her own uncertainty. She'd started it 3 months ago when her condition became impossible to hide, working on it in fits and starts between paying commissions. The rockers were complete, smooth curves that would someday soothe a restless child, but the headboard remained rough-hewn, waiting for inspiration that hadn't yet come. What did you carve for a child whose father had disappeared into the night like smoke, leaving nothing but shame and whispered speculation in his wake? Willa pushed the thought away and focused on the toy horse taking shape beneath her blade. Mrs. Patterson had ordered it for her grandson's birthday, paying in advance with coins that clinked together like tiny bells in Willa's apron pocket. The payment would buy flour and salt pork for another week, maybe 2 if she was careful. Independence had a price, and she paid it gladly rather than accept charity from the same people who crossed the street when they saw her coming. The settlement of Copper Falls had grown around the promise of mineral wealth, drawing fortune seekers and their families to this harsh valley where winter lasted 8 months and spring came reluctantly. But the easy gold had played out years ago, leaving behind a town that struggled to find its purpose. The lucky ones had moved on to newer strikes in Colorado or California. The rest stayed, clinging to fading hope and nursing grudges against neighbors who'd struck it rich or lost everything trying. Willa had been born here when the town was nothing but tents and mud, back when her mother still lived and her father's workshop rang with the sound of hammers and saws from dawn to dusk. Those were the golden days, when Sarah Dean's laughter filled their little cabin, and Thomas Dean's reputation brought customers from as far as Helena. But consumption took Sarah when Willa was 12, and something in Thomas died with her. He became quieter, more contemplative, pouring his grief into his work, until every piece that left his shop seemed to carry a weight of sorrow. "Measure twice, cut once," he used to tell her, his weathered hands guiding hers on the saw handle. But more important than that, child, listen to what the wood wants to become. Don't force it into something it's not meant to be. She'd learned to listen, not just to wood, but to the whispers that followed her through town. Willa Dean, the woodworker's daughter who thought herself too good for honest work. Willa Dean, who turned down 3 marriage proposals to stay in her father's shop. Willa Dean, who'd finally gotten what was coming to her, carrying a child with no husband to claim it. The whispers had grown louder 6 months ago, when her condition became obvious. She'd stopped attending church services, tired of Reverend Morrison's pointed sermons about the wages of sin and the sanctity of marriage. She'd stopped shopping at Henderson's general store when Martha Henderson began making loud comments about fallen women and their bastard children whenever Willa approached the counter. Now she traded with the Cheyenne who came through monthly, exchanging carved goods for supplies and finding more honesty in their broken English than in her neighbor's Sunday prayers. The child's father had been a traveling salesman named James Whitmore, smooth-talking and handsome in his city clothes. He'd arrived in early spring with a wagon full of patent medicines and promises, staying 3 weeks while he worked the mining camps and isolated homesteads. Willa had been lonely, still grieving her father's death, and James had been kind to her in ways that made her forget herself. He'd admired her work, called her talented and beautiful, and for a brief time she'd believed she might have a future that didn't involve growing old alone in her father's cabin. But James had moved on, as salesmen do, leaving behind nothing but empty bottles and a growing reminder of her foolishness. She'd written him one letter, care of the hotel in Helena, where he'd said he was heading, but never received a reply. By the time she was certain about her condition, winter had set in, and James Whitmore had vanished into the vast territory like a ghost. Now, 7 months along, she'd made her peace with raising the child alone. She had her father's trade, her own small piece of land free and clear, and hands that could shape wood into whatever was needed. It wasn't the life she'd dreamed of as a girl, but it was hers, earned through calluses and careful savings. The child would have a roof over its head and food on the table, even if it wouldn't have a father's name or a mother who fit society's narrow definition of respectability. The knock at her door came just after sunset, soft but insistent. Willa set down her carving knife and listened, her heart quickening. Few people visited after dark, and those who did usually brought trouble. She moved carefully to the window, her movements awkward with the child's weight, and peered through the gap in the curtains. A man stood on her porch, leaning heavily against the doorframe. His hat was tilted low, shadowing his face, but she could see the unsteady way he held himself. Blood seeped through his coat sleeve, dark against the weathered fabric, and his left leg ended at the knee, the empty trouser leg pinned up above a crude wooden crutch. "Please," he called out, his voice rough with pain and exhaustion. "I need help." Willa hesitated, her father's warnings about strangers echoing in her memory. But the man swayed on his feet, and she could see the pain etched in the lines around his eyes. Her hand moved to the door latch of its own accord. "I'm not looking for charity," he said, reading her hesitation. "I can pay." She opened the door and stepped back, letting him stumble inside. In the lamplight, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 35, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that needed cutting. His eyes were grey as winter sky, and they held a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. "You're bleeding," she said, stating the obvious because she couldn't think of anything else to say. "Rifle shot," he replied, settling heavily into the chair she offered. 3 days ago. I've been riding since." "Why didn't you go to town, Dr. Morrison?" "Can't." He met her eyes briefly, then looked away. "Got my reasons." Willa studied him, noting the quality of his boots despite their worn condition, the careful way he positioned his crutch, the silver buckle on his gun belt that spoke of better times. A man with secrets, then, like most who found their way to her door after dark. "I'll need to clean the wound," she said finally, "and you'll need food and rest." "I'm obliged." He reached into his coat pocket with his good arm and pulled out a small leather pouch. "How much?" "We'll settle up after I know what needs doing." She heated water on the stove and gathered clean rags, moving with the efficiency her father had taught her. "You didn't ask too many questions of people who came seeking help in the middle of nowhere. You helped if you could, charged a fair price, and kept your own counsel. It was a lesson that had served her well in a town full of gossips and judgment." As she cleaned his wound through and through that had missed the bone but left a ragged tear in the muscle, he told her his name was Cole and that he'd been riding north from Wyoming when claim jumpers ambushed him. The story had the ring of truth, but she sensed there was more he wasn't telling. His hands were soft for a drifter, and his speech carried the careful diction of education, despite his rough appearance. "This needs stitching," she said, examining the wound. "And you need rest. That infection could kill you if it gets worse. I can't stay long. You can't leave tonight either, not in this condition." She prepared a pallet near the fire, gave him broth and bread, and watched him fall into the deep sleep of exhaustion. Only then did she notice his crutch, propped against the wall where he'd left it. The thing was a crude affair, hastily made from a tree branch and some scraps of leather. It was too short for his height and poorly balanced, forcing him to lean at an uncomfortable angle that would cause him pain with every step. Looking at it, she felt something stir in her chest, not pity, but recognition. She knew what it was like to make do with less than you needed, to carry on despite the world's indifference to your struggles. The man had pride. She could see that in the way he'd offered payment before asking for help. Pride was something she understood. She picked up the crutch and carried it to her workbench, running her fingers over the rough wood. Her father's voice whispered in her memory, "Listen to what the wood wants to become." This wood wanted to become something better, something worthy of the man who would lean on it. Willa selected a piece of seasoned oak from her carefully hoarded supply, wood that had been drying in her father's shed for 5 years. Oak was strong, resilient, beautiful when properly shaped. She began to work, her movements sure and practiced despite the late hour. The child kicked restlessly as she worked, as if sensing her mother's sudden purpose. By lamplight, she carved and shaped, sanded and fitted. The leg took form slowly, not just functional but elegant, with carefully crafted joints that would move naturally with his gait. She worked through the night, pausing only to check on her patient and add wood to the fire. As dawn approached, she put the finishing touches on the leg, rubbing it with oil until the wood glowed like honey. When Cole woke, she was sitting beside his pallet, the finished leg across her lap. He stared at it in silence for a long moment, his grey eyes wide with something that might have been wonder. "You made this?" he asked, finally. "Your crutch was poorly made. This will serve you better." He sat up carefully, testing his injured arm. The fever had broken during the night, and though he was still pale, his eyes were clear. She helped him try on the leg, adjusting the straps and padding until it fit properly. When he stood, it was the first time in months, maybe years, that he'd been able to stand straight and tall. "I don't know what to say," he murmured, taking a few experimental steps. The leg moved smoothly, naturally, as if it had always been part of him. "You don't need to say anything." But he turned to her with an expression she couldn't quite read, gratitude mixed with something deeper, more complex. "What's your name?" "Willa Dean." "Willa." He tested the name on his tongue like he was tasting something precious. "Thank you, Willa Dean. You've given me back more than you know." She wanted to ask what he meant, but before she could speak, he was reaching for his coat and hat. The morning was still young, but she could see the urgency in his movements, the need to be moving on before the world woke up around them. "The payment," she said as he headed for the door. He pressed the leather pouch into her hand, and she felt the weight of gold coins inside. Too much, far too much for a night's shelter and medical care. But when she looked up to protest, he was already outside, settling into his saddle with an ease that surprised her. The wooden leg didn't slow him down at all. "I won't forget this," he called back to her as he rode away, his voice carrying on the morning wind. Willa stood in her doorway watching until he disappeared over the ridge, her hand still warm from his touch. Only then did she realize she'd never asked his last name, and he'd never asked about the child she carried or the lack of a wedding ring on her finger. For a few hours, she'd simply been Willa Dean, the woman who worked wood and cared for strangers in need. It was the first time in months that she'd felt like herself again. 3 days passed before Willa could shake the memory of grey eyes and the way Cole had looked at her wooden leg as if she'd handed him a miracle. She found herself glancing toward the ridge where he'd disappeared, her hands stilling on whatever project occupied her workbench. The gold coins he'd left sat heavy in her coffee tin, more money than she usually saw in 2 months of steady work. It was generous to the point of puzzling, the kind of payment that suggested either desperate gratitude or wealth far beyond what a drifting cowboy should possess. She'd counted the coins twice, running her fingers over their smooth surfaces and wondering at their origin. $20 gold pieces, minted in San Francisco, without the worn edges she'd expect from money that had passed through many hands. Fresh gold, the kind that came from banks or strong boxes rather than prospectors' pokes. It raised questions she wasn't sure she wanted, answered. The weather had turned bitter cold again, as it often did in late March, when winter made one last grab for the mountains before surrendering to spring. Willa kept the fire burning high and worked on small projects that didn't require her to venture outside a set of wooden spoons for Mrs. Ban. Chen at the laundry, a puzzle box for the banker's son, delicate work that kept her fingers nimble and her mind occupied. She was carving details into the puzzle box when she heard the hoofbeats, not the steady rhythm of a single horse, but the complex thunder of multiple animals moving at speed. Her hands stilled on the carving knife as the sound grew closer, accompanied now by the creak and rattle of wagon wheels and the jingle of harness metal. Willa rose carefully from her bench, her back aching from the child's weight, and moved to the window. What she saw there made her breath catch in her throat, and her heart begin to race with a mixture of disbelief and something that might have been fear. 2 wagons rolled up the rutted path to her cabin, each one pulled by a matched team of horses that looked like they'd stepped out of a cavalry unit. The wagons themselves were built for hauling precious cargo-reinforced sides, iron fittings, and canvas covers that couldn't quite conceal the glint of metal underneath. But it wasn't the wagons that made her knees go weak. It was the man riding beside them. Cole sat straight and tall in his saddle, no longer the wounded drifter who'd stumbled to her door 3 nights ago. His clothes were clean and well-fitted, his hat new, and the wooden leg she'd carved for him moved with such natural grace that a casual observer might never notice his disability. But it was his bearing that struck her most, the confident way he held himself, the easy authority in his posture as he spoke to the 4 men who flanked the wagons like guards. 4 armed men who looked at her cabin with the careful attention of professionals, their hands never far from their weapons. These weren't cowboys or miners. These were the kind of men wealthy people hired when they had valuable cargo to protect. Cole dismounted with fluid grace, the wooden leg supporting him perfectly as he walked toward her door. Each step was steady and sure, a testament to her craftsmanship and his own determination to master the prosthetic. He moved like a man who'd been given back not just his mobility, but his confidence. Willa opened the door before he could knock, stepping out onto the porch despite the cold wind that cut through her shawl. She needed the barrier of the threshold between them, needed the symbolic protection of her own doorstep as she tried to understand what she was seeing. "Hello, Willa," he said, and his voice was different, too still warm, still carrying that rough edge that spoke of hard living, but now with an undertone of something else. Command, perhaps. The voice of a man used to being obeyed. "Cole," she kept her own voice steady, though her heart was racing. "You came back. I said I wouldn't forget." He gestured toward the wagons, where his men waited with patient alertness. "I wanted to show you what you made possible." One of the men approached, older than the others, with silver threading his dark hair and scars that spoke of old battles. He carried himself with military bearing, and when he reached them, he touched his hat brim respectfully. "Ma'am," he said to Willa, then turned to Cole. "Mr. Callahan, we should—" "Mr. Callahan?" Willa interrupted, the name hitting her like a physical blow. Callahan. She'd heard that name before, whispered in the same breath as stories of lost fortunes and mysterious disappearances. "Your name isn't Cole." "It is," he said quietly. "Cole Callahan. I just left off the last part when we first met." The older man, clearly some kind of foreman or second-in-command, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, if we're going to make the bank before they close—" "Give us a moment, Frank." Cole's voice carried the unmistakable tone of authority, and Frank stepped back without argument. "Please." Willa felt the world tilting around her, everything she thought she knew about the wounded stranger, rearranging itself into a new and frightening pattern. Cole Callahan. The name belonged to stories she'd heard around winter fires, tales of a mining fortune lost to bad investments and family tragedy. Some said he'd gambled it away, others that he'd been cheated by partners. All the stories agreed on one thing: he'd walked away from everything and disappeared into the territory like smoke. "You're him," she said, and it wasn't a question. "The Callahan heir, the one who lost everything and ran away like a coward." His smile was bitter. "Yes, that's me. Or was me until 3 nights ago." She stared at him, trying to reconcile the broken man who'd stumbled to her door with this figure of legend. "The gold, where did it come from?" "It was always mine." He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, thick with documents. "I never lost the fortune, Willa. I buried it. Hid it so deep that even I almost forgot where it was. But I never forgot why I buried it." The wind picked up, sending snow swirling around them like ghosts. Willa pulled her shawl tighter, but she didn't retreat into the cabin. She needed to hear this, needed to understand what kind of man she'd helped and what it might mean for her future. "Tell me," she said simply. Cole looked toward the mountains, his grey eyes distant with memory. "I had everything once: money, position, a beautiful wife, and a future that stretched out like a golden road. Then the war came, and I went off to fight because it seemed like the right thing to do. When I came back," he touched his wooden leg absently, "I came back missing more than just my leg. Mary couldn't look at me anymore, couldn't stand to be touched by a cripple. She left with my business partner, taking what was left of my heart with her." Willa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She'd heard variations of this story before, men broken by war and betrayal, their spirits as damaged as their bodies. "I threw myself into business after that," Cole continued. "Made money hand over fist, but it felt like dust in my mouth. Everything I built, everything I owned, it was all just a way to fill the emptiness where my soul used to be. So one day, I loaded the gold into wagons just like these, drove them out into the wilderness and buried them. Then I threw away the maps and tried to forget I'd ever been anything but a drifter." "But you remembered," Willa said softly. "Not the way you mean." He turned back to her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "I remembered because of you, because of what you did for me. I made you a wooden leg. It's what I do." "No." He stepped closer, and she could smell the leather and wood smoke scent of him, could see the flecks of gold in his grey eyes. "You saw a broken stranger, and you helped him, not because you had to, not because there was anything in it for you, but because it was the right thing to do. You worked through the night to give me back my dignity. Do you understand what that meant to me?" Willa shook her head, overwhelmed by the intensity in his voice. "It meant that maybe the world wasn't as cold and empty as I'd thought. Maybe there were still people in it worth fighting for, worth building something for. Maybe I wasn't as dead inside as I believed." The child kicked hard against her ribs, reminding her of realities beyond this strange conversation. She pressed a hand to her belly, and Cole's eyes followed the movement. "When?" he asked, gently. "Soon, maybe a month." "And the father?" The old shame tried to rise in her throat, but she pushed it down. She'd made her peace with her choices. "Gone. It doesn't matter." "It matters to me." He reached out as if to touch her face, then let his hand fall. "Everything about you matters to me, Willa Dean." She wanted to step back, to put distance between herself and the complication he represented, but something in his voice held her frozen, something that sounded dangerously like hope. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. "Because I want to build something new, not just for me, but for you, for your child, for this whole forgotten corner of the world." He gestured toward the town below, barely visible through the blowing snow. "I want to build schools and hospitals, good houses for people who've been making do with too little for too long. I want to give back what I took when I buried my fortune and walked away from my responsibilities." "And you want me to, what? Be grateful? Fall at your feet because you're rich?" "I want you to let me court you properly. The words came out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back with effort. I want you to give me a chance to prove that I'm not the broken man who came to your door, and I'm not the fool who walked away from everything good in his life. I want to show you the man your kindness helped me remember I could be. Willa stared at him, her mind reeling. 3 days ago, he'd been a wounded stranger. Now he was offering her everything she'd never dared to dream, of security, respectability, a future for her child that didn't involve growing up as the bastard offspring of the town's fallen woman. It was too much, too fast, too overwhelming to process. I need time, she said finally. Of course, but she could see the disappointment flicker across his features before he schooled them back to careful neutrality. I'll be in town for a few days, getting my affairs in order. The hotel, if you need to find me. He started to turn away, then stopped. Willa, the leg you made meet's not just about walking, it's about standing tall again. You gave me that. Whatever you decide about the rest, I want you to know that your kindness changed everything. She watched him ride away with his wagons and his men, disappearing once again over the ridge, but this time she knew he'd be back. The question was whether she'd be ready for him when he returned. The wooden leg had changed everything, and Cole Callahan knew it with every step he took through the dusty streets of Copper Falls. 3 days since he'd revealed himself to Willa, and the prosthetic she'd crafted still felt like a miracle beneath him. Not just the smooth mechanics of it, the way the joints moved naturally with his gait, but what it represented, the first act of pure kindness he'd received in years, given freely by a woman who'd expected nothing in return. He paused outside Henderson's general store, watching through the window as Martha Henderson counted coins with the meticulous precision of someone who'd learned to make every penny matter. The afternoon sun slanted through the glass, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the golden light. This was the world Willa lived in, he reminded himself. A world where $20 gold pieces were small fortunes and pregnant women carved toys by lamplight to buy flour and salt pork. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and Martha looked up with the practiced smile she reserved for potential customers. Her expression shifted when she recognized him, not quite suspicion, but the careful neutrality of someone who'd heard whispers about strangers with too much money and too few explanations. "Mr. Callahan," she said, the name carrying a slight emphasis that suggested the whole town now knew who he was. "What can I do for you?" "I'd like to settle Miss Dean's account," he said quietly. "Whatever she owes, and credit for the next 6 months." Martha's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "Willa Dean don't owe nothing. She pays as she goes, always has." "Then credit for future purchases." "And what gives you the right to pay for Willa's goods?" The voice came from behind him, sharp with disapproval. Cole turned to find Reverend Morrison standing in the doorway, his black coat and severe expression making him look like a raven that had learned to walk upright. "Christian charity," Cole replied evenly, though something in the preacher's tone set his teeth on edge. "Christian charity toward a fallen woman?" Morrison stepped into the store, his boots clicking against the wooden floor. "Tell me, Mr. Callahan, what exactly is the nature of your relationship with Miss Dean?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a badly tended fire. Cole could feel Martha Henderson's attention sharpen, could sense the way she leaned forward slightly to catch every word. This was how reputations were destroyed, in small town-sown careless phrase repeated in the right ears. "Miss Dean provided medical assistance when I was injured," Cole said carefully. "I'm simply expressing my gratitude." Gratitude. Morrison tasted the word like it was bitter medicine. "And does this gratitude extend to acknowledging the child she carries?" The words hit Cole like a physical blow, not because of their content, but because of their cruelty. He'd seen this kind of moral bullying before, the way some men used righteousness as a weapon to cut down anyone who didn't fit their narrow definitions of proper behavior. "The child Miss Dean carries is blessed to have such a devoted mother," Cole said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that had once commanded respect in boardrooms and military camps. Any man would be fortunate to call them both family. Morrison's eyes glittered with something that might have been triumph. So you do intend to make an honest woman of her. I intend to treat her with the respect she deserves. Cole turned back to Martha Henderson, dismissing the preacher with the kind of casual indifference that spoke louder than any insult. About that credit arrangement. Now see here, Morrison began, but Cole cut him off with a look that could have frozen water in July. Reverend, I believe you have souls to tend and sermons to prepare. I wouldn't want to keep you from such important work. The dismissal was so complete, so effortlessly delivered, that Morrison had no choice but to retreat. But as he reached the door, he turned back with the kind of smile that promised future trouble. Welcome to Copper Falls, Mr. Callahan. I do hope you'll find our community educational. When the preacher was gone, Martha Henderson released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. That man, she muttered, shaking her head, always stirring pots that don't need stirring. About Miss Dean's account, Cole prompted gently. Right. Martha opened her ledger book, running her finger down a column of neat entries. Like I said, she don't owe nothing, pays cash for everything, even when times are tight. Proud as her father was. That one. Tell me about her father. Martha's expression softened with memory. Thomas Dean was the finest craftsman in 3 counties, could make wood do things that seemed like magic. Willa learned at his knee from the time she could hold a tool. She's got his hands and his eye for the work. And her mother? Sarah Dean was a saint if ever there was one. Beautiful, kind, patient as Job with that husband of hers. Thomas never got over losing her. Martha closed the ledger with a soft thump. Willa's been alone since he passed, trying to keep the workshop running and herself fed. Ain't been easy, especially with. She gestured vaguely toward her own midsection. The child's father? Martha's lips compressed into a thin line. Traveling salesman named Whitmore, smooth talker with city manners and promises, sweet as honey. Left soon as the snow melted, and ain't been heard from since. Cole felt anger kindle in his chest, hot and sudden. He'd known men like Whitmore charmers, who took what they wanted and moved on without a backward glance, leaving broken hearts and ruined lives in their wake. 6 months' credit, he said again, his voice carefully controlled. And if she needs anything beyond the ordinary, send word to me at the hotel. Martha studied him for a long moment, her shopkeeper's instincts warring with what she could see in his face. You're serious about her, ain't you? Dead serious. Well then. She opened her ledger again, making notations with careful strokes. 6 months it is. But Mr. Callahan, Willa Dean's got more pride than a barn cat and twice as much sense. You come at her wrong, she'll run you off faster than you can blink. I'm counting on her good sense, Cole replied. It's what makes her worth courting. He left the store and walked slowly down Main Street, taking in the details of the town that would become his home if Willa would have him. The wooden sidewalks were warped and splintered in places, the street rutted from the spring thaw. Most of the buildings leaned slightly, as if they were tired of standing upright in the mountain wind. But he could see potential in the crooked lines and weather-beaten facades, good bones beneath the wear, solid foundations that could support something better. Like himself, perhaps. Like the chance Willa had given him to stand straight again. The hotel was a 2-story building that had seen better days, but the lobby was clean and the proprietor respectful. Cole had taken the best room available, not from vanity, but because he needed space to spread out maps and documents as he planned for the future. His future, he hoped, would include a pregnant woodworker who carved miracles from oak and asked for nothing in return. Frank Thompson, his foreman, was waiting in the lobby with a leather portfolio thick with papers. Frank had been with the Callahan family for 15 years, serving first as a trusted employee and later as the guardian of secrets when Cole disappeared into the wilderness. The bank drafts are ready, Frank said without preamble. But Cole, are you sure about this? It's a lot of money to invest in a town that might not survive another hard winter. It's not about the town, Cole replied, taking the portfolio. It's about giving someone I care about a reason to believe in the future. Frank studied his employer's face, noting the change that had come over him in the past few days. The wooden leg had given Cole back his mobility, but something else had given him back his purpose. "The Dean woman," Frank said. "It wasn't a question." "Willa Dean," Cole corrected. "And yes, it's about her, about building something worthy of the kindness she showed a broken stranger." "And if she won't have you?" Cole looked out the hotel window toward the ridge where Willa's cabin sat, small and proud against the darkening sky. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the gift she's already given me." The wooden leg beneath him shifted slightly as he moved, a reminder of craftsmanship born from compassion. Tomorrow, he would begin the work of rebuilding not just his fortune, but his life. The question was whether Willa Dean would be part of that rebuilding, or simply the inspiration for it. Either way, he owed her everything. Willa ran her fingers along the smooth handle of her father's chisel, feeling the worn grooves where Thomas Dean's thumbs had rested through countless hours of careful work. The tool lay beside its companions on the workbench plane, all measuring square, and the collection of carving knives that had shaped furniture and toys for a generation of mountain families. Each piece bore the patina of use, the kind of honest wear that came from a craftsman who understood that tools were partners, not just instruments. Since Cole's revelation 3 days ago, she'd found herself returning again and again to her father's tools, as if their familiar weight and balance could anchor her in a world that suddenly felt unsteady. She picked up the measuring square, running her thumb along its perfectly straight edge, remembering Thomas Dean's voice. "Measure twice, cut once, and trust the tools that never lie to you." But what did you do when it wasn't wood you needed to measure, but a man's intentions? What tool could gauge the worth of promises made by someone who'd already proven he could disappear without a trace? The unfinished cradle watched her from its corner, its half-carved rails a reminder of her own uncertain future. She'd avoided working on it since Cole's visit, afraid that touching it might somehow jinx the fragile hope growing alongside the child in her belly. Better to leave it unfinished than to complete it and have it stand empty, a monument to another kind of abandonment. A sharp kick from the baby drew her attention back to the present. The child had been restless for days, as if sensing its mother's turmoil. Willa pressed both hands to her swollen belly, feeling the strong movements that spoke of a healthy, active infant. "What do you think, little one?" she murmured. "Can we trust a man who hides his name and buries his fortune, or are we better off with just each other?" The baby's response was another forceful kick, and despite everything, Willa smiled. Whatever else happened, this child would not lack for spirit. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her tense, but when she looked out the window, she saw not Cole's distinctive figure but old Henrik Larsson, the Norwegian trapper who lived even deeper in the mountains than she did. Henrik was one of the few people who still traded with her regularly, bringing furs to exchange for carved handles for his traps and tools. She opened the door before he could knock, noting the worry lines etched deeper than usual around his pale blue eyes. "Henrik, come in from the cold." "Nay, I cannot stay long." His English, after 20 years in the territory, still carried the musical cadence of his homeland. "I come to warn you, Willa girl, there is talk in town." "What kind of talk?" "The preacher man. He asks questions about you and this Callahan fellow, where you met him, how long he stayed, what services you provided." Henrik's weathered face flushed with embarrassment, but his eyes remained steady. "Some of the women, they listen and nod like hungry ravens." Willa felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame but from anger. She'd expected this, of course. In a town like Copper Falls, any association between an unmarried pregnant woman and a wealthy stranger would fuel speculation for months. "Let them talk," she said, though her voice carried less conviction than she intended. "There is more." Henrik shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly reluctant to continue. "This morning, I see men at the old Hendrik's place. Surveyors with their instruments, making marks on paper. And with them, men with guns." The Hendrik's place bordered her own small plot of land, a played-out mining claim that had sat empty for 3 years since old Pete Hendricks died of lung fever. If someone was surveying it, they had plans that might affect her own property. "Did you recognize any of them?" "The surveyor, he comes from Helena sometimes. But the armed men, Henrik shrugged, strangers, the kind who get paid to look dangerous. A chill ran down Willa's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. In her experience, surveying parties accompanied by armed guards meant someone was planning to claim more than empty land. Henrik, did anyone in town mention why they might be surveying that property? Rumors only. They say Callahan bought it. They say he plans to build something there. The old trapper's eyes sharpened. But why would he need men with guns to build a house? That was the question, wasn't it? Willa thanked Henrik and watched him ride away, his warning echoing in her mind. After he was gone, she stood in her doorway looking toward the ridge that separated her land from the old Hendrik's place. From here, she could see nothing unusual, but the knowledge that armed men were just over the hill made her skin crawl. She was still standing there when another rider appeared on the horizon, this one moving with the confident gait she'd come to recognize. Cole Callahan, returning as he'd promised he would. But instead of feeling anticipation, Willa found herself studying his approach with new suspicion. What kind of man needed armed guards to conduct honest business? Cole dismounted at her gate and approached on foot, his movements easy and natural despite the wooden leg. In the afternoon light, she could see the quality of his clothes, more clearly the fine wool of his coat, the silver buckles on his gun belt, the hand-tooled leather of his boots. These were not the possessions of a man who'd been living rough in the wilderness. Willa, he touched his hat brim respectfully, thank you for seeing me. I haven't invited you inside yet. I know. He stood at the bottom of her porch steps, making no move to climb them without permission. I wanted to talk to you about what I'm planning to do here, what it might mean for all of us, including the armed guards you've got surveying the Hendricks place. His expression didn't change, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested her question had hit home. You hear about that, did you? Henrik Larsson came by with a warning. He seemed to think I should be worried about men with guns setting up camp next to my property. Cole was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes fixed on something beyond her shoulder. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old regrets. The men aren't there to threaten anyone, Willa. They're there because I've made enemies over the years, people who might not want to see me reclaim what's mine. Frank Thompson me foreman, he insisted on the protection. What kind of enemies? The kind that come with making and losing fortunes. Business partners who felt cheated when I walked away. Competitors who moved into territory I abandoned. He met her eyes directly. I won't lie to you about the dangers, but I won't let those dangers touch you if I can help it. Willa felt the baby shift restlessly, as if responding to her elevated heartbeat. And what exactly are you planning to build that requires so much protection? A sawmill, to start with. This country's growing, and it needs lumber. After that, maybe a school, a proper church. Houses for people who've been making do with shacks and tents. His voice gained momentum as he spoke, painting a picture of a future that seemed almost too good to believe. I want to turn this valley into something worth staying for. And where do I fit into these grand plans? The question hung between them like a bridge that neither was quite ready to cross. Cole shifted his weight, and she heard the slight creak of the wooden joints that connected the leg she'd made to the flesh she'd helped heal. I hope you'll fit at the center of them, he said quietly, as my partner, my wife, the mother of our children. But even if you choose not to, even if you send me away tomorrow, I still intend to build something good here. You showed me that kind of goodness was possible. Despite her suspicions, despite the warnings and armed guards and buried fortunes, Willa felt something loosen in her chest. There was truth in his voice, the kind of raw honesty that couldn't be faked. Cole, she said, then stopped, unsure how to voice the fears that had been growing since Henrik's visit. What is it? I'm scared. The admission came out in a rush, surprising them both. I'm scared of hoping for something I might lose. I'm scared of trusting a man who's already proven he can walk away from everything. And I'm scared of what it might mean for my child if I choose wrong. Cole climbed the porch steps then, moving slowly so she could stop him if she chose. When he reached the top, he was close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his grey eyes, could smell the pine soap he used for shaving. "You know what scares me?" he said softly. "The thought that I might not be worthy of the chance you're thinking about giving me. The thought that this wooden leg might be the most honest thing about me." He gestured toward the prosthetic, and Willa followed his gaze to the smooth oak surface that bore the marks of her careful craftsmanship. "But then I remember that you made this leg for a broken stranger who had nothing to offer you but blood and trouble. You saw something in that stranger worth saving. Maybe you can see something in me worth keeping." Before she could respond, he was down the steps and mounting his horse again, giving her space to think without the pressure of his presence. "I'll be at the hotel for another week," he called as he rode away. "Whatever you decide, Willa Dean, I'll respect it." She watched him disappear over the ridge, her hand unconsciously moving to the place where the baby had kicked strongest during their conversation. Tomorrow, she would need to make a decision that would shape both their futures. Tonight, she would sit with her father's tools and try to measure the worth of a man who claimed to have found his soul in a wooden leg carved by firelight. The gold pocket watch caught the morning light as Cole pulled it from his vest, its polished surface reflecting the sun in brilliant flashes. The timepiece was beautiful 18-karat gold, with intricate engravings that spoke of master craftsmanship and considerable expense. But it was more than just a display of wealth. It was a tangible piece of the life he'd abandoned, a reminder of who he'd been before grief and guilt had driven him into the wilderness. Willa stared at the watch as Cole held it out to her, its weight substantial in her palm when she accepted it. The metal was warm from his body heat, and she could feel the steady tick of its mechanism against her fingers. On the back, an inscription caught her eye. "To my beloved husband, with all my love, Mary, Christmas 1864. "Your wife gave you this," she said, "and it wasn't a question. For our first Christmas together." Cole's voice carried old pain, carefully controlled, but not quite hidden. "I kept it through everything, the war, the injury, the divorce, even when I was living like a vagrant in the mountains. Foolish, perhaps, but some things are too precious to abandon, even when they hurt to hold." The watch seemed to grow heavier in Willa's hands as she absorbed the implications of his words. This wasn't just jewelry or a symbol of wealth, it was a link to his past, to love and loss, and the man he'd been before the world broke him. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked softly. "Because I want you to understand what I'm offering you isn't just money or security. It's everything I have, everything I am, including the parts that are damaged." He paused, his grey eyes meeting hers directly. "I won't pretend I don't carry scars, Willa, but I'm hoping you might see past them to the man I could still become." Before she could respond, the thunder of hoofbeats filled the air, not the measured cadence of a single rider, but the chaotic drumming of multiple horses moving at speed. Cole's hand moved instinctively to his gun belt as they both turned toward the sound, and Willa felt her heart begin to race as she recognized the approach of trouble. A dozen riders crested the ridge, moving with the purposeful coordination of men who'd ridden together before. At their head was a figure Willa recognized, with sinking dismay. Sheriff John Brennan, his badge glinting on his chest and his face set in hard lines that promised nothing good. Behind Brennan rode a mix of townspeople and strangers, some carrying surveying equipment, others bearing the unmistakable signs of hired guns. But it was the man riding beside the sheriff who made Cole's expression darken with something that might have been recognition. "Trouble?" Willa asked quietly. "The worst kind," Cole replied, his voice grim. "Official trouble backed by unofficial money." The riders pulled up in Willa's yard, their horses snorting and stamping in the cold morning air. Sheriff Brennan dismounted with the slow deliberation of a man who knew he held all the cards, his eyes moving between Cole and Willa with barely concealed satisfaction. "Mr. Callahan," Brennan said, touching his hat brim in a mockery of politeness. "Miss Dean, sorry to disturb your morning, but we've got some business to conduct." "What kind of business?" Cole asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Brennan reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, its official seals and ribbons, marking it as a legal instrument of some importance. Seems there's been some questions raised about property lines in this area. The Territorial Surveyor's Office has ordered a new survey of all claims, including this one. On whose authority? Cole's voice had gone dangerously quiet. Mine, said the man who'd ridden beside Brennan, spurring his horse forward. He was well dressed in the manner of successful businessmen, with soft hands and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Allow me to introduce myself, Edmund Morrison, Territorial Land Commissioner. I believe you know my brother, Reverend Morrison. The family resemblance was clear once he'd identified himself, the same narrow features and calculating expression, though Edmund wore his ambition more openly than his preacher brother. Cole's jaw tightened as he processed the implications of this family connection. Commissioner Morrison, Cole said carefully, I wasn't aware the territorial government had concerns about property rights in Copper Falls. Oh, we always have concerns when large sums of money start changing hands, Edmund replied smoothly, especially when those sums involve claims that may not be as secure as their current occupants believe. Willa felt the blood drain from her face as the man's meaning became clear. They weren't just here to survey, they were here to challenge her right to the land her father had claimed and worked for over 20 years. This property is legally held, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. My father filed all the proper claims. Ah, but did he? Edmund Morrison pulled out another set of papers, these bearing the territorial seal. Our records show some irregularities in the original filing. Overlapping claims, boundary disputes, questions about whether the proper fees were paid. It was a lie, and they all knew it. But it was a lie backed by official documents and the authority of the territorial government, which made it more dangerous than simple dishonesty. How much? Cole asked bluntly. I beg your pardon. How much is someone paying you to find these convenient irregularities? Cole stepped forward, and despite his wooden leg, his movement carried unmistakable threat. Because I'm willing to bet I can pay more. Edmund's smile was as cold as winter wind. Mr. Callahan, I'm shocked that you would suggest such a thing. This is simply a matter of ensuring that all property rights in the territory are properly documented and legally sound. And if they're not, then the land reverts to territorial control, to be redistributed according to proper legal procedures. Edmund's eyes glittered with satisfaction. Of course, legitimate claimants would have the opportunity to reapply for their holdings, assuming they can meet the current requirements. The trap was beautifully laid, Willa realized with growing horror. They could challenge her father's original claim, declare the land forfeit, and then sell it to whoever had paid them to orchestrate this farce. By the time any appeals worked their way through the territorial courts, her cabin would be ashes and her livelihood destroyed. You have no right, she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew how hollow they sounded. Right had nothing to do with this. It was about power and money, and the kind of men who used both to take what they wanted. I have every right, Edmund replied. In fact, I have a duty to ensure that territorial lands are properly managed and legally held. Sheriff Brennan, if you would be so kind as to serve the notice. Brennan stepped forward with obvious reluctance, extending another document toward Willa. Miss Dean, you're hereby notified that your property rights are under review. You have 30 days to present documentation supporting your claim, after which time the territory reserves the right to reassign this land. Willa took the paper with hands that shook only slightly, her mind racing as she tried to process the disaster unfolding around her. 30 days to prove something that had never been in question, to fight a system that had already decided against her. There's just one problem with your plan, Cole said conversationally, his tone so casual that it took a moment for the menace beneath it to register. And what's that? Edmund asked. Cole reached into his own coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, thick with documents. As of yesterday, I own the mineral rights to this entire valley, including Miss Dean's property. Any attempt to reassign her land would have to go through me. The silence that followed was so complete that Willa could hear the wind singing through the pine trees on the ridge. Edmund Morrison's face had gone pale beneath his carefully groomed beard, and even Sheriff Brennan looked uncertain. "That's impossible," Edmund said finally. "Is it?" Cole's smile was sharp as broken glass. "I purchased the rights from the Territorial Mining Office in Helena last week, paid in full, with all the proper documentation. I'd be happy to show you the papers." He opened the portfolio and withdrew a document that bore official seals and signatures, holding it out for Edmund to examine. The land commissioner's hands shook slightly as he read, his face growing paler with each line. "This says you own the mineral rights to the entire Copper Falls district," Edmund said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every claim, every prospect, every played-out hole in the ground." Cole's voice carried the satisfaction of a man who'd just won a game his opponents hadn't even known they were playing. "Which means that any land redistribution in this area would require my approval, and I'm afraid I'm very particular about who I do business with." The gold pocket watch in Willa's hand seemed to pulse with warmth, reminding her that the man beside her was far more complex and dangerous than she'd imagined. He'd just outmaneuvered corrupt officials with the kind of political and financial sophistication that spoke of years in the halls of power. "Gentlemen," Cole continued pleasantly, "I believe your business here is concluded." The family portrait was cracked down the middle, the glass spider-webbed from some long-ago impact that had split the image of Cole's former life in two. He held the damaged daguerreotype carefully, his fingers tracing the fractured surface as he sat across from Willa at her kitchen table. The afternoon light slanted through her windows, illuminating the photograph's sepia tones and the ghost of happiness it contained. "That was our wedding day," Cole said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years and regret. "Mary Elizabeth Hartwell, the banker's daughter from Denver. Beautiful, accomplished, everything a man could want in a wife." Willa studied the photograph, seeing past the damage to the young couple frozen in formal poses. Cole looked impossibly young, his face unmarked by the lines that now spoke of pain and loss. The woman beside him was indeed beautiful, delicate features, elaborate dress, the confident bearing of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. "What happened to her?" Willa asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. "The war happened. I went off to fight, like so many other young fools, thinking it would be glorious, that I'd come home covered in honor and ready to build an empire." His laugh was bitter. "I came home missing a leg and half my soul. Mary tried to love the man who returned, but he wasn't the one she'd married." The baby kicked sharply against Willa's ribs, as if responding to the pain in Cole's voice. She pressed a hand to her belly, feeling the child's restless movement beneath her palm. "She left you because of your injury?" "She left because I became someone she couldn't recognize. The leg was just part of it." Cole set the photograph down carefully, aligning its edges with the grain of the wooden table. "I was angry all the time, bitter about what I'd lost, what the world had taken from me. I threw myself into business deals like they were battles to be won, making money but losing everything that mattered. Mary needed a husband who could love her, and I'd forgotten how to love anything but my own pain." The honesty in his voice cut deeper than Willa had expected. She'd known men damaged by war before the territory was full of them, survivors who'd learned to function but never quite learned to live again. But hearing Cole speak of his failures with such clear-eyed assessment made her realize how much strength it took to acknowledge such truths. "The divorce was final in 1869. Cole continued. "She married my business partner 6 months later. They have 3 children now, I'm told. A good life, the kind she deserved. And you've been alone since then?" "By choice, mostly. I told myself I was protecting the world from my darkness, but really, I was protecting myself from the possibility of failing someone else I cared about." He looked at her directly, his grey eyes holding depths she was only beginning to understand. "Until I met a pregnant woman who looked at a broken stranger and saw something worth saving." The weight of his words settled between them like stones dropped into still water. Willa felt the ripples of implication spreading outward, touching every corner of her carefully ordered life. This wasn't just about attraction or gratitude. This was about two damaged people recognizing something in each other that might heal them both. "Cole," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the fears that had been growing since Edmund Morrison's visit. "What you did today with the mineral rights show, did you know they would try to take my land?" His expression grew grim. "Because I've seen it before. The Morrisons, both of them, have been working this kind of scheme for years. Edmund uses his position to create legal problems. His brother provides moral justification, and together they force people off valuable land. Then they sell it to their associates at territorial auctions for pennies on the dollar. But you stopped them. This time. But Willa, you need to understand, this won't end here. Men like Edmund Morrison don't give up when they encounter resistance. They adapt, find new angles of attack." The baby chose that moment to kick again, and Willa winced at the force of it. The child was getting stronger, more active, as if preparing for its entry into a world that was proving more dangerous than she'd anticipated. "What do you think they'll do next? They'll look for leverage. Ways to pressure you, hurt you, make staying here too costly to bear." Cole's voice carried the hard-earned wisdom of someone who'd fought these battles before. "They'll spread rumors, make business difficult, maybe even try legal action on different grounds. And you think your money can protect me from all that?" "Not my money alone." He leaned forward, his intensity making the air between them feel charged. "Willa, what I'm offering isn't just financial protection, it's partnership. Real partnership between equals who respect each other's strength." She wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at her like a persistent ache. "How can we be equals when you have so much more than I do?" "Because you have something I lost years ago, the ability to see good in the world, to act with kindness instead of calculation. You carved me a new leg, not because you had to, but because it was the right thing to do. That's worth more than all the gold I buried in these mountains." The words hung between them, sincere and vulnerable, in ways that made Willa's chest tight with emotions she wasn't ready to name. But before she could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the window. Frank Thompson rode up to the cabin, his face set in the grim lines that meant trouble. He dismounted quickly and approached the porch with the urgency of a man bearing bad news. "Cole," he called, not bothering with formalities, "we need to talk, now." Cole rose from the table, his wooden leg creaking slightly with the movement. "What is it?" "Morrison's men have been asking questions in town. About Miss Dean, about the baby, about how long you've been acquainted." Frank's eyes flicked to Willa apologetically. "They're building a case that you two have been conspiring together, that the mineral rights purchase was part of some elaborate fraud." Willa felt her heart sink as the implications became clear. Of course, they wouldn't give up. They'd simply find another way to attack, using her reputation and Cole's presence to create a scandal that would justify their actions. "What kind of questions?" Cole asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "The kind that make a pregnant woman's life miserable. They're suggesting that you've been here longer than you claim, that the child might be yours, that the whole injured stranger story was an elaborate deception." The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Willa gasped at the sharp pain that shot through her side. Both men turned to her with concern, but she waved them off, focusing on the bigger problem. "They're going to destroy my reputation completely," she said, understanding the strategy with crystalline clarity. "Make me into a liar and a schemer, so no one will believe anything I say about my father's claim." "Worse than that," Frank said grimly. "They're talking about having the territorial marshal investigate charges of fraud and conspiracy. If they can make those stick—" "Prison," Cole finished, his voice flat with understanding. "They'd send you to territorial prison, and the child would go to an orphanage." The room seemed to tilt around Willa as the full horror of the situation became clear. She'd thought they were fighting for her land, but they were really fighting for her freedom, her child's future, everything that mattered in her world. "There is one way to stop this," Cole said slowly, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "What?" "Marry me, tonight. Make their accusations meaningless by giving them a truth they can't twist. He reached across the table and took her hand, his fingers warm and steady against her palm. I know it's not how either of us imagined it would happen, but Willa, I love you. I've loved you since you worked through the night to give me back my dignity. Let me give you back yours. The proposal hung in the air between them, born of desperation but carrying the weight of genuine feeling. Willa looked down at their joined hands, then at the cracked photograph that showed the ruins of his first attempt at happiness. "And if it doesn't work," she asked quietly, "if they find other ways to hurt us?" "Then we'll face them together," Cole said simply. "But at least your child will have a name, and you'll have someone standing beside you when the world tries to tear you down." The baby kicked once more, a strong, determined movement that seemed almost like approval. Willa closed her eyes and felt the weight of her father's memory, the promise of her child's future, and the impossible hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd found someone worth trusting with both. The land deed lay spread across Willa's kitchen table like an accusation, its official seals and careful script telling a story that changed everything she thought she knew about Cole Callahan and his motivations. Her hands trembled as she read the document Frank Thompson had reluctantly placed before her, the legal language as damning as it was precise. Mineral Survey Report, Copper Falls District, filed January 15, 1877, she read aloud, her voice growing steadier with each word. Surveyor's note: extensive copper and silver deposits located on property 47B, currently claimed by Thomas Dean, deceased, inherited by Willa Dean. Estimated value: 500 to 750 in recoverable ore. The silence that followed was so complete that Willa could hear the wind rattling her windows and the soft tick of Cole's gold pocket watch on the table beside the deed. When she finally looked up at him, his face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan, and his grey eyes held the trapped look of a man caught in a lie he'd hoped never to tell. "You knew," she said, "and it wasn't a question. When you came to my door bleeding and broken, you already knew what was buried under my land. Willa, you knew." Her voice grew stronger, fueled by an anger that was building like a fire fed with dry kindling. "That's why you were here, isn't it? Not because you were ambushed by claim jumpers, but because you were surveying my property, looking for the best way to steal what my father spent 20 years building." Cole started to rise from his chair, but she held up a hand to stop him, her eyes never leaving his face. She needed to hear this, needed to understand the full scope of his deception before she could decide what it meant for her future. "Tell me the truth," she demanded, "all of it, starting with why you were really on my land that night." Frank Thompson shifted uncomfortably, his weathered face creased with what might have been sympathy. "Miss Dean, maybe I should." "No." Cole's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried enough authority to silence his foreman. "She deserves the truth, all of it." He sat back down heavily, his wooden leg creaking with the movement. For a long moment, he stared at his hands, gathering the courage to destroy whatever trust he'd managed to build between them. "I hired the surveyors 3 months ago," he said finally. "After I retrieved my fortune from where I'd buried it, I started looking for investment opportunities. Good land, mineral rights, properties that could be developed. The Territorial Mining Office had reports of promising deposits in this area, so I came to investigate. And my father's land showed the most promise. Your father's land sits on top of one of the richest copper veins in the territory, maybe in all of Montana." Cole's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "I spent 2 weeks camped in the mountains above your cabin, watching you work, studying the lay of the land, planning how to approach you about selling." Willa felt something cold and hard settling in her chest, squeezing her heart until each beat was painful. "So everything, the injury, the helplessness, the gratitude, it was all an act?" "No." The word came out with such force that it startled them both. "Willa, no. The injury was real. The claim jumpers were real. They shot me because I was trespassing on land they thought they could steal. I crawled to your door because it was the only light I could see, and I was dying. But you knew who I was." I knew you were Thomas Dean's daughter. I knew you lived alone and worked wood. I knew you were pregnant and that the town treated you badly because of it." His voice grew quieter, more intense. "What I didn't know was that you'd work through the night to carve hope out of oak for a stranger who'd come to cheat you." The baby kicked restlessly against Willa's ribs, as if sensing her distress. She pressed both hands to her belly, trying to calm the child and herself, while she processed the magnitude of Cole's revelation. "The wooden leg," she said slowly. "When I made that for you, did you see it as an opportunity, a way to get closer to me?" "I saw it as a miracle." Cole's eyes never left her face, and despite her anger, she could see the truth in them. "Willa, I came here planning to buy your land for a fraction of its worth. I had documents prepared, legal strategies mapped out, ways to pressure you into selling. But when you handed me that leg, when you gave me back my dignity without asking for anything in return—" "What?" "I fell in love with you." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they could cross. "Not with your land, not with what it could give me, but with the woman who saw a broken stranger and chose kindness over suspicion." Frank Thompson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Cole, we should probably—" "Frank's been after me to tell you the truth for weeks," Cole continued, ignoring his foreman's discomfort. "He said it wasn't fair to court you under false pretenses, that you deserved to know why I was really here." "And what did you tell him?" "That I was a coward, that I was afraid if you knew the truth, you'd see me the way I saw myself as, a man who'd sunk so low he was willing to cheat a pregnant woman out of her inheritance." Willa rose from the table and walked to the window, needing distance from Cole's intensity and the weight of his confession. Outside, the mountains stretched toward the horizon, their peaks touched with gold by the setting sun. Somewhere beneath those peaks lay the fortune that had brought Cole to her door, the mineral wealth that had made her a target for men like the Morrisons. "The marriage proposal," she said without turning around. "Was that part of your plan too? Marry me and gain legal access to the land?" The long silence behind her was answer enough. When she finally turned back to face him, Cole's face was grey with shame. "At first," he admitted, "when I learned about the mineral deposits, marriage seemed like the most efficient way to secure the claim. But Willa, by the time I proposed to you this afternoon, it had nothing to do with the land. I proposed because I love you, and because I want to protect you from men who would use you the way I originally planned to." How convenient that love and profit aligned so perfectly. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, but she felt no inclination to soften them. Her entire world had been rewritten in the space of 20 minutes, and she needed time to understand what that meant for her and her child. Frank Thompson stood up awkwardly, clearly eager to escape the tension that filled the small cabin. "I'll wait outside," he mumbled, heading for the door. "Frank." Willa's voice stopped him at the threshold. "This survey report, who else has seen it?" "Just us. And the territorial mining office in Helena, where Cole bought the original mineral rights." Frank's expression was grim. "But Miss Dean, if the Morrisons get their hands on this information, they'll have all the ammunition they need to destroy me completely." Willa finished the thought, understanding the implications with crystalline clarity. "They can claim I've been hiding valuable assets, that any challenge to my land claim is justified by the wealth involved." "Which is why you need to marry me," Cole said urgently. "Tonight, before they can act, if we're married, your assets become mine legally, and their schemes become irrelevant." "Your assets, you mean?" Willa's laugh was as bitter as his had been. "How perfectly it all works out. You get the land, the minerals, and the woman, all wrapped up in one neat legal package. That's not what I want, isn't it?" She moved back to the table and picked up the survey report, studying the numbers that represented more wealth than she'd ever imagined. $500,000 in recoverable ore. That's quite a prize for a few months of courtship. "Willa, please, get out." The words came out quietly, but with such finality that both men froze. "Both of you, get out of my house." Cole started to protest, but she cut him off with a look that could have frozen fire. "You want me to trust you? You want me to believe that your feelings are genuine, Then give me time to think without your presence clouding my judgment. Give me space to decide whether I'm looking at the man who carved hope into my life or the one who came here to steal everything my father worked for. Cole rose slowly, his movement stiff with more than just the limitations of his wooden leg. At the door, he paused and looked back at her. "The leg you made me," he said quietly. "It's still the most honest thing about me. Everything else may be complicated, but that what you gave me that night, that was pure kindness meeting pure need, nothing can change that." After they were gone, Willa sat alone with the survey report and the weight of her shattered trust. The baby kicked restlessly, and she wondered what kind of world she was bringing. A child into a world where kindness could be a weapon and love could be a lie, dressed up in wooden legs and gold pocket watches. Outside, night was falling over the mountains, and somewhere in the darkness, the Morrisons were planning their next move in a game where the stakes had just gotten impossibly higher. The sheriff's badge caught the lamplight as John Brennan polished it with careful strokes, his weathered fingers working over the tarnished metal until it gleamed like a promise of justice. But there was nothing just about what Sheriff Brennan was planning, and the badge had become little more than a prop in a theater of corruption that was about to claim its final victim. He sat in the back room of Henderson's General Store, where the weekly poker games had evolved into something much more sinister, planning sessions for men who'd decided that the law was simply another tool to be bought and wielded by those with enough money and influence. Around the table sat the power brokers of Copper Falls, Edmund Morrison with his territorial authority, his brother the Reverend with his moral righteousness, banker Charles Whitmore with his financial leverage, and three other men whose names mattered less than their willingness to profit from another's misfortune. "The Dean woman has refused all reasonable offers," Edmund was saying, his soft hands shuffling through a stack of legal documents. "Which means we proceed to the final phase." "And Callahan?" Brennan asked, though he already knew the answer. "Callahan is the key to everything. With him out of the picture, the woman becomes vulnerable again. Her mineral rights revert to territorial control, and we can proceed with the original plan." Banker Whitmore leaned forward, his pale eyes glittering with avarice. "The copper deposits alone are worth 3 times what we'll invest in this operation. Add the silver veins, and we're looking at the kind of wealth that transforms men from comfortable to powerful." Outside, a bitter wind howled down from the mountains, rattling the store's windows and sending snow spiraling through the darkness. The weather was turning nasty, which would work in their favor. Bad weather kept people indoors, made them less likely to investigate unusual sounds or ask inconvenient questions. "The plan is simple," Edmund continued, spreading a hand-drawn map across the poker table. "Callahan's men are quartered at the old mine shaft, thinking they're protecting him from claim jumpers. But what if the claim jumpers were already inside their perimeter?" "You're talking about murder," Reverend Morrison said, though his tone carried more calculation than moral objection. "I'm talking about justice. Callahan is a fraud and a schemer who's been deceiving that poor woman since the day he arrived. When he's exposed and dealt with accordingly, we'll simply be restoring the natural order." Brennan studied the map, noting the positions Edmund had marked. How many of his men? 4, plus Callahan himself. All armed, all experienced, but not expecting trouble from within. And after? After, we present Miss Dean with evidence of Callahan's deception, which we now possess, thanks to his own surveyor's reports. We offer her a choice. Sell the land to our consortium for a fair price, or face territorial investigation for conspiracy and fraud. A pregnant woman with a bastard child won't last long in territorial prison. The casual cruelty in Edmund's voice made even Brennan uncomfortable, though he'd long since sold his conscience for the promise of easy money. Still, there was something unsettling about destroying a woman who'd done nothing worse than trust the wrong man. "When?" he asked. "Tonight. The weather provides perfect cover, and tomorrow we can present the whole affair as a tragic misunderstanding that got out of hand." 3 miles away, in the warmth of her cabin, Willa Dean sat beside her workbench, her father's tools spread before her like old friends, offering silent counsel. She'd spent the hours since Cole's departure in restless motion pacing, sitting, standing, trying to find a position that would ease both the baby's restless kicking and her own churning thoughts. The survey report lay folded beside her father's measuring square, its revelations still sharp enough to cut. $500,000 in mineral wealth, buried beneath land her father had claimed for the price of filing fees, and 20 years of back-breaking work. It was a fortune that could transform not just her life, but the entire territory. And it explained everything about Cole's presence, both his original deception and his desperate desire to protect her from men who would kill for such wealth. She picked up her father's carving knife, feeling its familiar weight in her palm. Thomas Dean had taught her that tools were extensions of the craftsman's will, that honest work with honest tools could create something lasting and beautiful. But what happened when the foundation itself was built on deception? A sharp contraction gripped her belly, strong enough to make her gasp and nearly drop the knife. She'd been having them on and off for hours, but this one was different, deeper, more insistent, carrying the unmistakable message that her child was preparing to enter the world, whether she was ready or not. "Not tonight," she whispered to her belly, pressing both hands against the tightening muscles. "Please, little one, not tonight." But even as she spoke, another contraction followed the first, and she realized with growing alarm that her child had chosen the worst possible moment to make its debut. She was alone, miles from town, with a blizzard building outside and enemies closing in around her. The sound of approaching horses made her heart race, but when she looked out the window, she saw not the threatening silhouettes she'd feared, but the familiar figure of Cole Callahan riding through the swirling snow. He wasn't alone. Frank Thompson and 2 other men flanked him, all of them moving with the urgency of people who'd received bad news. Cole dismounted quickly despite his wooden leg, his movements sharp with controlled panic. When he reached her door, he didn't knock but called out urgently, "Willa, are you all right?" She opened the door, one hand braced against the frame as another contraction swept through her. Cole's face went white when he saw her condition. "The baby?" "Soon, I think." She managed to keep her voice steady, though her whole body was trembling. "Cole, what's wrong? Why are you here?" "We have to get you out of here, now." He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the cabin for threats. "Henrik Larson rode to town to warn us. Brennan and the Morrisons are coming tonight. They're planning to kill me and frame you as my accomplice." "Kill you?" The words hit her like a physical blow, cutting through her anger and confusion to reveal the fear beneath. Whatever Cole's original intentions, the thought of him dying filled her with terror. The mineral survey made them desperate. "They can't let me live to protect your claim, and they can't let you live to inherit that much wealth." His hands moved to her shoulders, steady and warm despite the chaos around them. "Willa, I know you don't trust me, and you have every right not to, but right now I'm the only thing standing between you and men who would murder a pregnant woman for money." Another contraction, stronger than the others, doubled her over with pain. When it passed, she found Cole supporting her weight, his face tight with concern. "How long between the pains?" he asked. 10 minutes, maybe less." "Frank!" Cole called to his foreman, who was standing guard at the window. "How long do we have?" "Maybe an hour." Henrik saw them leaving town, but the snow will slow them down. Cole's mind raced through their options, all of them bad. Willa was in no condition to travel, especially in a blizzard, but staying meant facing armed men in a cabin that offered little defensible position. Worse, if the baby came during a fight, both mother and child would be helpless. "There's another way," Willa said suddenly, her voice cutting through his thoughts. "What?" "The mine shaft where your men are staying. There's a passage that connects it to the cave system under my property. My father showed it to me when I was young, said it was an old Cheyenne shelter that connected to the copper veins." Cole stared at her, understanding dawning in his grey eyes. "You're talking about going underground, while you're in labor?" "I'm talking about surviving long enough for this baby to be born." Another contraction gripped her, and she breathed through it with the focused determination of a woman who'd already decided her path. "Cole, I may not trust your motives, but I trust your commitment to protecting this child. Will you help me?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications that went far beyond the immediate crisis. She was asking him to risk everything, his men, his fortune, his life for a woman who'd just learned he'd originally come to cheat her. "Yes," he said simply. "But Willa, if we do this, if we go into those tunnels together, you need to know something." "What?" "I love you. Not your land, not your mineral rights, not what you can give me. I love the woman who worked through the night to carve hope from oak. I love the mother who's willing to crawl through mountain caves to protect her child. I love you, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving it if you'll let me." Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, and in the distance, the faint sound of hoofbeats carried through the storm. Time was running out, and decisions had to be made that would determine not just their survival, but the future of the family they might become. Willa looked into Cole's eyes and saw something she'd been afraid to believe: genuine love mixed with desperate determination to protect what mattered most. The wooden leg beneath him creaked slightly as he shifted his weight, reminding her of the night she'd chosen compassion over suspicion. "Help me gather what we'll need," she said, making her choice. "And Cole, when this is over, when our child is safe and the Morrisons are dealt with, we're going to have a long conversation about trust and truth and what it means to build something lasting together." "I'm counting on it," he replied, already moving to help her prepare for the most dangerous night of their lives. The iron horseshoe was still warm from the forge when Willa wrapped her fingers around it, the metal holding heat like a promise of protection in the cold darkness of the tunnel. She'd forged it herself that afternoon, working through the pain of early contractions to create something that could serve as both tool and weapon if needed. The horseshoe's weight was solid and reassuring in her palm, a reminder that her father had taught her to work iron as well as wood. "Can you make it another 100 yards?" Cole asked softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of water dripping from limestone walls. The tunnel stretched ahead of them, carved by centuries of underground streams and widened by Cheyenne hands into a passage that connected the mountain's hidden places. Willa nodded, though another contraction was building in her lower back, spreading around her belly like bands of heated iron. She'd been timing them as they moved through the tunnel site, minutes apart now, growing stronger and more insistent with each wave. The baby was coming whether she was ready or not, but she was determined to reach the safety of the mine shaft before she could no longer walk. Frank Thompson led the way with a shuttered lantern, its dim light casting dancing shadows on the tunnel walls. Behind them, Cole's other men, Williams and Rodriguez, watched their backtrail for signs of pursuit. The Morrisons' hired guns would eventually find the tunnel entrance, but by then, Willa hoped to be in a defensible position, surrounded by people who would protect her child. "There," Frank whispered, pointing ahead to where the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. "The mine shaft connects just beyond that opening." They emerged into a natural cave that had been enlarged by mining operations, its walls showing the marks of picks and shovels where Thomas Dean and other prospectors had followed promising veins of ore. Wooden supports held up sections of the ceiling, and rails for ore carts ran along the floor, disappearing into darkness in both directions. Cole's men were waiting for them, four experienced fighters who'd served with him in various capacities over the years. They'd prepared the chamber as a defensive position, with supplies, weapons, and clear sight lines to all approaches. When they saw Willa's condition, their professional composure cracked slightly. "Ma'am," said the oldest of them, a grey-haired man named Peterson, "you shouldn't be down here in your condition." "Where I shouldn't be," Willa replied through gritted teeth as another contraction peaked, "is anywhere the Morrisons can find me." She leaned against the cave wall, pressing the warm horseshoe against her lower back, where the pain was strongest. Cole moved to her side, his wooden leg sure on the uneven ground. "How much time do you think we have?" "Not long," Frank replied, checking his pocket watch. "They'll search the cabin first, but when they don't find us—" The distant sound of voices echoing through the tunnels cut off his words. Male voices, harsh with anger and frustration, growing closer with each passing second. "Positions?" Cole ordered quietly, and his men moved with practiced efficiency to defensive spots around the chamber. "Willa, there's a smaller passage behind that ore cart. If shooting starts, I'll be too busy having a baby to worry about bullets," she interrupted, then immediately regretted the sharpness in her tone. Fear was making her snappish, and Cole didn't deserve her anger when he was risking everything to protect her. The voices grew louder, accompanied now by the splash of boots in underground puddles and the scrape of weapons against stone walls. Sheriff Brennan's voice carried over the others, giving orders with the authority of his badge and the confidence of a man who believed he held all the advantages. "Spread out when we reach the main chamber. Callahan's got maybe 4 men with him, but they're cornered. Don't give them any chances to." His words cut off abruptly as the first of the intruders reached the chamber entrance and found himself staring down the barrel of Peterson's rifle. For a moment, time seemed suspended, with both sides frozen in the instant before violence erupted. Then Brennan shouted, "Take them!" and the cave exploded into chaos. Muzzle flashes lit the chamber like lightning, the sound of gunfire deafening in the enclosed space. Willa pressed herself against the cave wall, the iron horseshoe clutched in one hand while the other supported her belly. A contraction chose that moment to grip her, and she bit down on her own wrist to keep from crying out. Cole crouched beside a wooden support beam, returning fire with calm precision despite the wooden leg that made movement awkward. She could see the careful way he positioned himself, using the prosthetic as a stable base while his good leg provided mobility. The leg she'd carved was serving him well in this deadly dance. A bullet whined off the stone near her head, and suddenly the horseshoe in her hand felt inadequate against the violence surrounding them. But then she remembered her father's words about honest tools and honest work, and her grip tightened on the iron. If someone came close enough, she'd make sure they remembered that Thomas Dean's daughter knew how to fight for what was hers. The wedding ring was simply a plain band of gold that Cole had carried in his vest pocket for 3 years, originally intended for a woman who'd left him before he could offer it. Now, as gunfire echoed through the mine chamber and Willa gripped his hand through another contraction, it seemed like the most important object in the world. "I can see the head," Frank Thompson called out from where he knelt beside Willa, his weathered hands steady despite the bullets whining overhead. The old foreman had delivered foals and calves in his ranching days, and those skills were serving them well in circumstances no one could have imagined. Cole squeezed off another shot at the muzzle flash in the tunnel entrance, then turned his attention back to Willa. Her face was streaked with sweat and dirt, her hair plastered to her forehead, but her eyes held the fierce determination of a woman who would not let fear or pain stop her from bringing her child safely into the world. "The next contraction," Frank said urgently. "Push with everything you have." The gunfight had reached a deadly stalemate. Sheriff Brennan and his men controlled the tunnel approaches, but Cole's people held the high ground and better defensive positions. The sound of ricochets filled the air as bullets sparked off stone walls and wooden support beams, creating a deadly crossfire that neither side could break through. But the real battle was being fought in the small alcove where Willa labored to give birth, while chaos raged around her. Each contraction was stronger than the last, demanding everything she had, while the sound of gunfire provided a hellish soundtrack to the most important moment of her life. "One more push," Frank encouraged, his voice cutting through the noise of combat. "Just one more." Willa bore down with strength she didn't know she possessed, her hand crushing Cole's fingers as she brought their child into a world that seemed determined to destroy them all. The pain was beyond anything she'd ever experienced, but beneath it was something else, fierce joy that no amount of danger could diminish. The baby's cry cut through the gunfire like a blade, sharp and clear and impossibly alive. For a moment, even the shooting seemed to pause as both sides registered the sound of new life entering their deadly conflict. "A son," Frank announced, his voice thick with emotion as he wrapped the infant in clean cloth. "A strong, healthy son." Cole felt tears streak down his face as he looked at the tiny bundle in Frank's arms. The child was perfect in fingers, 10 toes, and lungs that could compete with the gunfire for sheer volume. When Frank placed the baby in Willa's arms, Cole saw something transform in her expression, a completion that made everything they'd endured worthwhile. "He's beautiful," Cole whispered, reaching out to touch the baby's miniature hand. Tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb with surprising strength, and he felt his heart expand to accommodate a love he'd never imagined possible. "Callahan," Sheriff Brennan's voice boomed through the chamber. "This ends now. Surrender, and the woman and child won't be harmed." Cole's jaw tightened with anger at the lie in Brennan's words. Men who would murder a pregnant woman for money wouldn't hesitate to kill her and her newborn son to tie up loose ends. "What's your answer, Sheriff?" Cole called back, pulling the gold ring from his pocket. "Because I've got a proposal of my own." In the brief lull that followed, Cole turned to Willa with the ring extended. "I know this isn't how either of us imagined it would happen, but will you marry me? Right here, right now, with gunfire as our wedding music and this cave as our chapel." Willa looked from the ring to his face, then down at their son nursing contentedly, despite the chaos around them. When she spoke, her voice was clear and certain. "Yes, but not because of the land or the money or the legal protection. Because you're the man who stood by me while I brought our son into the world, even when bullets were flying and death was stalking us through these tunnels." "Our son?" Cole's voice cracked with emotion. "He's yours if you want him, not by blood, but by choice. By the promise to love him and protect him and teach him to be better than the men who would use violence to steal what belongs to others." Frank Thompson, still holding his makeshift medical supplies, straightened up with dignity despite their surroundings. "By the authority vested in me as a ship's captain 20 years ago, and witnessed by God and these good men, I pronounce you husband and wife." Cole slipped the ring onto Willa's finger, just as another volley of gunfire erupted from the tunnel entrance. But this time, the shooting was coming from behind. Brennan's position reinforcements had arrived, and they weren't friendly to the corrupt sheriff's cause. "That'll be Henrik and the miners," Peterson called out with satisfaction. "Old Norwegians got more friends in these mountains than Brennan ever imagined." The tide of battle was turning, and as Cole kissed his new wife while their son slept peacefully in her arms, he realized that sometimes the greatest victories came not from defeating your enemies, but from finding something worth fighting for in the first place. The wooden leg beneath him creaked slightly as he shifted position, reminding him that all of this had started with an act of kindness from a woman who saw broken things as opportunities for healing. Now they were a family, forged in fire, and bound by promises that no amount of gold or corruption could break. The new school bell rang clear and sweet across the valley, its bronze voice carrying hope to every corner of Copper Falls as children gathered for the morning lessons. 6 months had passed since that terrible night in the mine tunnels, and the town had transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible when corruption and greed held sway over honest people's lives. Willa stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse, her son Thomas named, for her father sleeping peacefully in her arms, despite the cheerful chaos of children arriving for class. At 6 months old, little Thomas was the image of contentment, with his mother's dark hair and eyes that seemed to shift between her brown and Cole's grey, depending on the light. He was a child born of violence but raised in peace, and his presence had become a symbol of renewal for the entire community. "Mrs. Callahan," called out young Mary Patterson, running up the schoolhouse steps with her wooden lunch pail clutched in both hands. "Is Mr. Callahan going to teach us about measurements today?" "He'll be here after the morning lessons," Willa replied, adjusting Thomas's blanket against the autumn chill. "He's very excited to show you how to use the tools properly." Cole had insisted on including practical education in the school's curriculum: woodworking, metalwork, and basic engineering, alongside reading and arithmetic. "A person's hands should be as educated as their mind," he'd said when they planned the school, and Willa had fallen in love with him all over again for understanding what her father had always believed. The schoolhouse itself was a testament to that philosophy. Built from timber cut at Cole's new sawmill and fitted with hardware forged in the expanded blacksmith shop, it represented the marriage of vision and craftsmanship that had become Cole and Willa's joint legacy. Every beam was precisely cut, every joint perfectly fitted, every detail a reflection of the care that went into creating something meant to last for generations. Inside the single large classroom, 23 children sat at desks that had been crafted in Willa's workshop during the long summer months. Each desk bore the subtle signature of her tool-smooth curves that invited touch, joints that would hold firm against decades of use, surfaces that glowed with the warmth of properly finished wood. Teaching the children had given her a new purpose, one that honored her father's memory while building toward a future none of them could have imagined. "Today we're going to learn about fractions," announced Miss Elizabeth Harper, the young teacher Cole had recruited from a teacher's college in Denver. She was a serious young woman, with kind eyes and infinite patience, exactly what the children of Copper Falls needed to prepare them for a world that would demand both knowledge and wisdom. As the lessons began, Willa walked across the town square to the site where Cole was overseeing construction of the new church. The old building had burned down mysteriously 2 weeks after Sheriff Brennan and the Morrisons were arrested after a fire that many suspected had been set to destroy evidence of the corruption that had infected the town like a disease. The new church was rising from local stone and timber, its simple lines reflecting the honest faith of people who had learned to distinguish between religion and righteousness. Reverend Morrison had been replaced by Pastor Daniel Wright, a circuit preacher who believed that God's work was best done with open hands and generous hearts rather than judgment and condemnation. "How's the bell tower coming?" Willa asked, finding Cole in conversation with the stonemason about the foundation work. "Another week, maybe 2, he replied, turning to greet her with the smile that still made her heart skip despite 6 months of marriage. "The bronze work is more complex than we anticipated, but it'll be worth it when we hear those bells ring." The wooden leg moved naturally beneath him now, so perfectly integrated into his movements that strangers never noticed his disability. Willa had made adjustments twice as his body adapted to the prosthetic, refining the fit and balance until it truly became part of him. It remained the most honest thing about their relationship, a symbol of healing offered freely and accepted with gratitude. "Thomas is growing so fast," Cole observed, reaching out to stroke the baby's cheek with one finger. "Soon he'll be walking around the workshop, getting into everything." "Just like his grandfather did," Willa said with a smile. "Papa used to tell stories about me as a toddler, how I'd disappear into the wood shavings and emerge looking like a tiny scarecrow." They walked together toward their home, the house Cole had built on the ridge, overlooking both the town and Willa's original cabin. It was a practical building designed for a growing family, with large windows that captured the mountain light and a workshop attached to the main structure where Willa could continue her craft while staying close to her children. The mineral wealth beneath their land had indeed transformed their lives, but not in the ways the Morrisons had imagined. Instead of hoarding the fortune, Cole and Willa had invested it in the community, the school, the church, improved roads, a proper doctor's office, and businesses that provided steady employment for families who had been scraping by on hope and determination. "Any regrets?" Cole asked as they reached their front porch, where 2 rocking chairs waited in the afternoon sunshine. Willa settled into her chair with Thomas still in her arms, considering the question seriously. 6 months ago, she'd been a pregnant woman alone in the world, surviving on pride and skill, while her neighbors whispered about her fall from grace. Today, she was a wife, mother, teacher, and cornerstone of a community that valued her contributions. "Only one," she said finally. "What's that?" "I regret that Papa didn't live to see this, to see his grandson, to see what we've built here, to know that his tools are still shaping the future in ways he never imagined." Cole reached over and took her free hand, his thumb tracing the simple gold band that had bound them together in a cave, while bullets flew and their son entered the world fighting. "He does see it," Cole said quietly. "Every time you pick up one of his tools, every time you teach a child to measure twice and cut once, every time you choose kindness over suspicion, he's here in all of it." As if in response to his father's words, Thomas stirred in Willa's arms and opened his eyes, looking up at the two people who had fought through deception and danger to create the family he'd been born into. His tiny hand reached out and grasped Cole's finger with the same determination that had marked his dramatic entrance into the world. In the distance, the school bell rang again, calling the children back from their midday break. Soon, Cole would walk down to teach them about craftsmanship and precision, about the dignity of honest work and the satisfaction of creating something lasting with your own hands. And someday, when Thomas was old enough, he would learn those same lessons, carrying forward the traditions that connected him to the grandfather he'd never met and the father who'd chosen to love him. The wooden leg creaked softly as Cole rose from his chair, ready to return to the business of building a future worthy of the woman who'd given him back, his soul with nothing but oak and kindness and the courage to see broken things as opportunities for healing.